Right, so it's quite simple, Dave. How much, in light of what you've just heard, should horse racing be worried about the idea of these affordability checks being brought into law?
Well, I think it should be worried, certainly. I mean, as Colin Hoard said then, it does involve an awful lot of intrusion into your own private fiscal affairs. There was a very good piece by Robin Oakley in The Spectator on this subject. I mean, those of us who have worked in the industry for as long as you and I have, as Colin alluded to, that it does seem as though this is a very, very difficult thing to police and to enforce, doesn't it? In the sense that you can, there are, if with the FOBTs reduction in stakes, it's easy to police. You can't go somewhere else and feed money into a FOBT, which is, I know, a small but easily identifiable part of the problem. With affordability checks, that there are myriad ways of avoiding and evading that, aren't there?
Yes, there are, including just going into a high street shop.
Absolutely.
Handing over as much cash as you can get your hands on.
I think that this is an interesting balance between, obviously this is a fashionable, it's an item that's very much in the public consciousness, the ills of gambling to society. It's often an uncomfortable marriage between the Guardian and the Daily Mail, where they go for the same thing, and indeed Labour and Tory politicians. Go on,
this is it, and as I said at the beginning of the programme, it's perfect for newspapers, tabloid and broadsheet, because it's setting up this sort of binary issue between the libertarians and the sort of nanny state, if you like.
I mean, it's worth bearing in mind, and I'm not trying to be falsely optimistic or foolishly optimistic about this, but the principal reason for this review is to bring gambling legislation up to date. And since the last gambling review, the big changes are people just betting over and over again on smartphones and in terms of turnover on football. So I think that's going to be the area that's in the centre of the crosshairs, if you like. It's not to say that racing won't be affected. I'm sure it will be, but I wonder if there might actually be a positive in this for racing, whereby gambling companies cannot advertise, that they're limited in spending money in other ways, and maybe that might be spent on horse racing. Maybe that's a foolish and a false hope, but it's certainly a possibility.
We are going to know so much more 7 days from now. I'm quite sure of that. Let's talk about some of the week's other news issues, because there's been plenty in the news. Well, Southall, first of all, and this, I must say, this passed me by, Dave, but the local council have objected to the laying down of the new surface at Southall, which was going to turn it into the brand new, spanking, shiny, best all-weather track in the country.
Indeed. This is actually a story that we first broke in the Daily Mirror in 2018. January 2018, about the switch from five-a-side to Pater. And it was then 2 years later.
Is that the Royal we broke the story in the Daily Mirror?
Yeah, sort of. It was my story.
You broke the story in the Daily Mirror.
But it's a team game, so we broke it. And obviously then this was revealed in the trade paper recently, but there has been an objection. I think the switch of surfaces is going to be voted on by the Newark and Sherwood District Council, I think next month. But there has been an objection because fibre sand, because Tapater contains the chemical ethylene, which, according to the people who objected to it this week, last week, was a chemical that is injurious to, toxic to both humans and animals. Of course, Michael Dickinson, the man who invented Tapater, has said that the surface is, of course, absolutely safe for all forms of life. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this. I should stress that it's not just. This is not, I repeat, not a move by the local councillors to stop Fiberstand being replaced by Tapeta because they love betting on those Fiberstand horses who turn up at Southwell and grind out the business time and time again and can't do anything on other surfaces.
So, how's this going to unfold, do you think?
They will approve the new surface, and Southwell will get Tapeta, and in time Wolverhampton will be closed and sold for housing, I suspect.
Okay, although representatives of ARC, when last questioned about that, strongly refuted claims that Wolverhampton would be closed. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. Now, Aidan OBrien made the point this week when talking after the international classifications that he would be prepared to base staff in the UK if he needed to in order to facilitate horses running in classics with a continuation of the pandemic. That's not such a news story in and of itself, Dave. It's more, shouldn't some of the jumps trainers who are wanting to run at the spring festivals be adopting a similar strategy, or at least prepared for those eventualities?
Yeah, I think that's the nub of it, really, isn't it? In that, of course, Aidan OBrien was fined £4,000, wasn't it? For that was the week before last, I think, for the mix-up in the Fillies Mile, where, of course, the two horses were confused for each other by staff who were based in the UK, and they weren't as familiar maybe with the two fillies as they should have been, and so there was that mix-up. And of course, what this doesn't do is prevent this sort of thing happening again necessarily. We didn't really think it would happen in the first place, I don't think. But you've got to the absolute crux of this matter, and that is, surely this is something that's going to happen with Irish trainers and staff with regard to Cheltenham and probably Aintree as well, isn't it?
I would have thought so, and we've discussed this before on this show. We discussed it last week. Is the prevailing situation just going to mean that some of those Irish trainers will run fewer horses at the Cheltenham Festival?
Well, I wondered that, and I wondered whether, I mean, obviously, if there are going to be fewer horses, we know which ones that are going to be the first out of the balloon, if I can use that phrase with regard to thoroughbreds. It's going to be the ones who are the bigger prices, isn't it? We're not going to see the stable stars not turn up because of staffing difficulties with COVID-19. So I suspect we probably will see fewer Irish runners, but obviously we'll still see the stars.
I mentioned the Irish Horse Racing Regulatory Board, the IHRB, in conversation with Tim Husbands and the difficult weeks that they've had, and I'm not just talking about the Charles Burns case either. There's a story today suggesting there's been a whistleblower on illegal substances. I'm sure we're going to hear more about that story. There are going to be more bad news stories to follow for the Irish regulator. There was a story again this week, Dave, about them being unable to put into place the intended plan to test horses in premises that aren't licensed because COVID had meant they hadn't been able to train the officers swiftly enough.
Yes, and a spokesman for the IHRB said to the Racing Post that this wasn't going to delay the testing system, and that as soon as everybody was trained up, the testing would roll out. But it seems to be that the training has been held back by the COVID-19 crisis. And so it looks as though, I think Tim Husbands referred to gaps in service delivery. And obviously the IHRB is undergoing a tough time at the moment. The storm clouds are gathering over Irish racing and probably by association UK racing too. People will be well aware of the Sunday Times journalist David Walsh and the Herculean job, an extremely courageous job he did in the battle with Lance Armstrong over the years before he was finally exposed as having taken EPO and winning those 7 Tour de France. Paul Kimmage, of course, of the Irish Independent, another person who was a huge part of that story and of that struggle to bring Walsh to justice. Both those journalists have got their teeth into this issue at the moment. Paul Kimmage spoke of the omertà in Irish racing, the culture of secrecy that the word, of course, comes from the Irish Cosa Nostra, the branch of the mafia in Sicily. Now, there may exist an omertà as things stand now, but I suggest that that probably won't last for very long, particularly the story that broke on Friday with the whistleblower who's been working with Catherine Murphy of who's the politician in County Kildare.
Yeah, so there's quite a bit about that last part of that story that's pretty opaque at the moment, but again, it'll become clearer. Now, Cheltenham Crowd, I think even the most ardent optimist, Dave, would suggest that crowds at Cheltenham are unlikely, but the executive are keen to stress that it's not impossible if there's any movement on the government side.
Eek. This is a very, very tricky one, isn't it? I mean, for weeks...
When I say crowds, I mean a smattering, maybe,
Yeah.
owners prioritised and the odd fan.
Yeah, we don't expect that there are going to be full stands, do we, for one moment? But I think this is one where racing has to tread very carefully, don't you? Because I think that Cheltenham got, in my opinion, an awful lot of unfair stick for the festival in 2020 being staged. It did so in accordance with government advice, and I think that lots of newspapers whose journalists have, I think, a lot of the time quite lazy and ill-researched pieces into that decision to hold the festival. Lots of newspapers, if you said to Reach PLC, the bosses of the Daily Mirror, the Express and the Star, we want you to can your big readers' festival because of a public health issue, but the government says we advise you to proceed, there's no way that Reach bosses would say, right, well, we're going to can it anyway. But there is we are behind square one, aren't we, in that sense?
I suppose what the executives might be thinking is that if schools are going back on the 8th of March, potentially, so there is some sort of lifting of restrictions, do we then go back into what was a sort of, I don't know, tier 3/4 situation? And that would then allow, within that template from before, say owners at the racecourse or whatever.
Yeah, it's very tricky. I mean, I wrote to Oliver Dowden months and months ago, didn't even get one of those things to say the MP has received
passed on your concerns to the minister. Yeah.
But I know, you know, we've spoken regularly to on-course bookmakers and the difficulties that they've had, and let's be honest about it, there are aspects of this science that are absolutely bonkers. You can't play golf at the moment, you can't play tennis, but you can stand next to someone in a shop or public transport. I don't understand that, and I know we've got to move on. I don't see why over the last few months that there can't be a government committee that says, right, what do we think about golf then? Yeah, 2 people per tee, not 4, they must wear this, that and the other, but they can play. Why can't that be done? There would be thousands of activities that they could work through.
I think it can under a tier system, but if you're in the middle of a national lockdown, it is, you know, and I understand that. Let's talk about the stable form of the Tizard yard, which I know is something you wanted to touch upon. It's not as though it hasn't been spoken of, but it is becoming a real concern. Yeah,
I mean, this is a very interesting issue, stable form, isn't it? Which, as you mentioned earlier in the programme, Lee Mottershead had written a piece about in the Racing Post this week, and it's 39 days since the Tizard team had a winner. I can't remember the horse's name. It's at Huntingdon, I think, the final day before the Christmas break. Does that work out? Yeah, it probably does. And in that time, of course, there have been defeats, if not necessarily disappointments, for some of the stable's big names. The reason that this story was written this week, of course, is that at Newbury on Saturday week, we're going to see Native River and probably we'll see a couple of other horses from the Tizard team that will be their Cheltenham hopefuls. And so there will be people who say, if you're measuring stable form by the number of days since the last winner, you are a caveman. But I would respond to that by saying, well, if I wanted a right few quid on a horse that is near the front of the market for a particular race, I'd like to see the stable having a few winners. there is possible good news, I suppose, for the yard. In the last two or three seasons, they've had fantastic run-ups to Cheltenham, and then, apart from a couple of high-profile successes, the festival hasn't been a particularly happy 4 days for the Tizard team. Maybe think it might go the other way this time round.
Yeah, it is a fact that trainers tend to have times of the year where they do well, and those things are not coincidental.
But this is now a time, December, January, we're used to seeing the Tizards knock them in left, right and centre, aren't we?
You know, as night follows day, this corner is about to turn. And of course, the clever punter is the one who identifies exactly when it's going to turn and starts getting over the odds for the next however many horses.
Yeah, fair. And I really hope it does. It's great dealing with the Tizard team, but you know, it's a matter of fact that it's 39 days since they had their last winner.
Now, you know as well as I do, you are not going to get over the odds on any horse ridden by Benoit de la Sayette any time in the near future, because this guy is a star. There is no doubt. He was a pony racing star in the East Anglia region and across the country. His father worked for Godolphin in the heyday, and here he is, just steering a whole slew of winners to victory for a variety of trainers, including his boss, John Gosden. I mean, that tells you something in itself. And the new training sensation, the similarly exotically named Kevin Philippard de Foy. So the de la Sayette de Foy partnership is something we're going to be talking about plenty as well.
Well, you've said in that preamble there that he's the stable, or he's apprenticed to John Gosden, and that does tell its own story, doesn't it?
This does not look like a £7 claimer.
No. Is it 7 winners from his last 21 rides? Is that correct?
Yeah, he's going at 33%, yeah. He's only ridden 21 rides. He's had 7 winners. He's 5 from his last 15.
Yeah. It's very promising. It looks, for all the challenges of the last few months, it looks as though we've got some very promising young riders on the flat. Of course, Laura Pearson is one who's had a wonderul December and has continued that on into the new year. So, yeah, as I say, that the fact that he's with the Gosden team tells much of its own story, doesn't it? Because even in the early days of their career, very promising sportsmen tend to get hitched up pretty early to the big concerns.
Yeah, I think it's exciting. I mean, it's exciting in the way that Cawthon was exciting when he was 17 and Dettori when he first came over at 16, 17 and started to do really well. I mean, I know the sport reveres diligence and hard work above all else, and that's quite right in many respects. But when you see a bit of natural flair, there's nothing like it.
That's what all sports fans like to see, isn't it? Is exactly that magic, of course.
And those were this week's talking points. Subscribe to Racing TV to be notified when more Luck on Sunday videos are appearing online. And don't forget to join me for the show every Sunday morning from 9 o'clock with the best guests.